Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here today. So what we're going to talk about today starts really quite a while ago when I was in my first job in Pittsburgh. And that first job was actually to be what's called a consultation liaison doctor. And what you do there is you go around to all the hospitals in the area and you treat the people with psychiatric problems who are on like the medical floor or the surgical floor. So this was my first job, and there was no one to really cover the women's hospital. So I took that part of the job. In the first 3 months that I was there, I began to notice an interesting pattern. And that pattern was that of some of the cases that I got, some of the ones that were most distressing to the doctors and nurses were the ones where I was asked to find out, could the mother take care of the baby? Now, there were a couple of different kinds of cases there. Some of them, the mothers had had the babies previously taken away or other children taken away. And then some of them, the moms just didn't seem to be attached at all or didn't seem to care about the babies. And those were really interesting. Some of them had postpartum depression, but for the most part, they didn't. What tied both small groups of women together was that I discovered that they both had histories of what we call antisocial behavior. So that was kind of curious to me because when I was a resident in psychiatry, we were taught a lot about boys' antisocial behavior, and we knew that many boys with antisocial behavior went on to become adult criminals. But you know, pulling up my memory banks, I didn't actually know much about girls. And so I went to the literature, and indeed I found out that there wasn't much there. There was some, but not too much there. But for the most part, people actually felt that belief was that girls' antisocial behavior was not that important. And so what you see behind me actually is a quotation from one of the predominant thinkers in the delinquency and antisocial behavior in the 60s. And as you can see, it basically says the delinquent girl is not very interesting. All right? And she really, really just, has this sexual misbehavior. She's promiscuous. And actually, some of the psychoanalytic literature said, if you actually get these girls married and they have children, that's curative. So I thought, that's not what I'm seeing. I'm seeing some problems in adulthood or young adults that are really important. So I decided to actually really comb the literature and write a systematic review of what actually we knew. So I reviewed all the literature in the 20th century that I could find about what happens to these girls as they grow up to be young adults. And what I found was amazing. And again, there wasn't a lot, but there were some longitudinal studies buried deep. What I found, first of all, is that a lot of them died early. 6 to 10 times higher mortality rate in this population than in girls and women who didn't have antisocial behavior, many of them violent deaths. I also found out that about 65% of them did go on to become criminals. It's just that in the criminal population, such a small percentage is women, that they didn't really stand out. In addition, I found that about 50% of them went on to have major psychiatric problems like depression, and even more had substance use problems. Now, the final thing that was interesting is at least 50% had problems in every domain of adult life, including being able to take care of their children. So I thought this is really, really very important to study and to figure out what was wrong. On top of it, it turned out that there was evidence emerging that antisocial behavior in girls was increasing. So we now know that currently about 10% of the general population of adolescent females have antisocial behavior. That's pretty high. So I decided to study this. After many years of study, we've collected a lot of information. So some of the first stuff that we found out that's been also studied by others is that antisocial girls have trouble thinking. The executive portion of their brain, the CEO in the front, actually doesn't work that well, so that they are impulsive, they have trouble making rational decisions, and their behavior can be explosive. We also found out that they have problems with their families. Their problems also in trusting their families. They also have trouble trusting peers. And in addition, we found out that they also have problems in their neighborhoods. Okay, so it seems like maybe the treatments that people should normally use with this kind of behavior should work, because those treatments actually address family problems. So for example, there's parent training. Also, there's cognitive behavior therapy, and you sit down and you talk to the girls, and you basically try to stop them from being aggressive, etc. So these sorts of things should work, right? Well, the results were kind of disappointing. Now let me just make sure that we're both all on the same page about what kind of girls we're talking about. So on one hand, I have a case of a girl named, and these are not real cases, but they're amalgamations from research in my clinical work. Girl named Shauna steals her mother's credit card, persuades her younger sister Corey to take a bus with her to New York City, where she promptly meets a man in a coffee shop. He's 30 years old, Shauna's 17. She decides to go off with him. She leaves Corey, abandons her without any money or any food, and just goes off. Over here we have Mariah. Mariah has had a history of school failure. She's not doing that well in school. She also has a history of staying out very late at night, not following her curfew, and she's been bullying another girl at school and actually been the ringleader for many other girls bullying this girl. And indeed, they created, Mariah, the ringleader, created a Facebook page for a false boyfriend who fell in love with this victim and on Facebook. And then when the victim went to meet the boyfriend, she actually was greeted by Mariah and all of her peers ready to ridicule the girl. So that's an example, 2 examples of the kind of cases that I see in research. So the kind of treatments like family treatment, boot camp, behavior treatment, etc., don't seem to work that well. So we were really intrigued. Why is that? So we actually have done some other work that seems to relate to some of the reasons. So I hypothesize that there are actually 4 reasons that the treatments don't work. One is, most of them were created for boys. These are girls, and we're different from males. Second, girls like this, we know, have trouble attaching. That's what I told you. We found they have trouble attaching, and they have trouble being intimate. So that when you have to have psychotherapy work, you're sitting in a room with someone, this does not work very well because you can't attach to that person. The other problem is that these treatments actually did not take into account things like exposure to maltreatment, which is neglect or abuse or early adverse events. And the 4th reason is that they don't take into account any biological factors. So we didn't know biological factors, much about biological factors when these treatments were being created, but our lab and several others now have some very interesting evidence that should be considered, is my argument, in trying to design new treatments. So what we found in our lab is that we actually take girls like this and we expose them to an experimental stressor. It's called the Trier Social Stress Test, or TSST for short. What happens when that kid gets exposed to that stressor is that their brain detects a threat and is supposed to send out a cascade of various hormones along the way, and then the final stage is that the little gland on top of your kidneys, this little cap-shaped bit of fat is what it looks like, although it's not that, is your adrenal gland. It secretes cortisol. And cortisol does a number of very important things in your body. What we've found is that if you see this slide, the girls in blue are the girls with no disorder at all, and the girls in red are the girls with conduct disorder. And this is cortisol secretion after time 0, which is when we actually gave them the stressor. Look at the difference. And this is statistically significant. This is from a paper that we're about to send off next week. So there's a very big difference. So what's the problem? Isn't low stress reaction good? Actually not. It's really, stress response system function is meant to be flexible so that you adapt to environmental changes. And it's a Goldilocks phenomenon. You need to have just the right amount, not too much and not too little of cortisol. If you have too little, a variety of other things happen in your brain, and you don't learn from negative experiences. So for example, you or I going into the store and seeing a lovely red sweater on the shelf, we don't steal it. Why? Because we anticipate that we'll get caught, and that causes anxiety. And that's because we have mounted at some time in the past a normal stress response. These girls don't learn from those negative experiences because there's not enough cortisol. The other reason we don't is because we can empathize with the store owner's grief if things are stolen. That also requires cortisol. So that is one piece of biological evidence that's important to keep in mind. Others have produced recently other interesting biological features. So for example, Fairchild and his group in the UK recently put out a beautiful study in which they actually looked at brain imaging. And what they found is that in girls with antisocial behavior, there are areas of the brain that are smaller in the girls who are aggressive and the girls who don't have capacity for empathy. And those areas of the brain are connected with stress response system function. And finally, the last piece I'd like to present today is there is new genetic data on girls with antisocial behavior. Lee and Lee in 2010 demonstrated very nicely that gene variations in one of the serotonin genes combined with maltreatment produced a 12-fold increased chance of being in the antisocial group if you were a girl. This is very important because maltreatment not only perhaps winds up with antisocial behavior in interaction with the gene, but also is responsible for producing dysregulation of the stress response system. So, where does this leave us in terms of looking at new treatments? Where this leaves us is that we need to be looking at treatments, first of all, that are studied and designed for girls. Second, we need to be trying to fix the situation for girls who've been mistreated or maltreated. And there are several new programs that we should be looking at specifically for girls. Connect program, the collaborative problem solving. And finally, what we need to be doing is we need to be looking at ways to make their stress response systems more flexible again through mindfulness meditation. And there are little bits of research, just case studies, that indicate that this is very useful in girls with antisocial behavior. So I expect, and this is where our lab is going, that in the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to have a dramatically different type of study on treatment of these kids. One, they're going to be treatments of girls, and the second thing is they're going to be looking at biological factors and whether or not those are changed. And we hope that if we study both things together in the population of interest, we can help these girls with these very serious disorders. Thank you very much.